My stepson hired a lawyer and filed false abuse claims to get my 14-year-old daughter removed from our home. He wanted to inherit my house, $420,000, and needed her gone first. The social worker arrived with police. My daughter didn't panic. She calmly walked to my bedroom, got her journal, the one where she documented everything, and handed it to the officer. I said nothing. I just watched as the social worker's face changed. Then she told my stepson, "That diary proves the child abuse claims were fabricated," and my stepson's face went pale. "I want you to understand something before I tell you how we got here. I was standing in my own living room, in the house I bought in 2019 with money I earned, and I was watching a 26-year-old man try to dismantle my life with a stack of forged paperwork. The afternoon light was coming through the blinds in long slanted lines. I could smell the coffee I'd made at 7 that morning, still sitting cold in the pot on the counter. My hands were steady, my breathing was even, because I had known for at least 8 months that something like this was coming. I just hadn't known exactly what shape it would take. Let me tell you how we got here. I married Daniel Reeves in June of 2016. I was 34. He was 41. He had a son from his first marriage, Marcus, who was 19 at the time of the wedding. My daughter, Layla, was 7. Daniel and I had dated for 2 years before the wedding, which meant Marcus had been in my peripheral vision for those 2 years. Quiet at holidays, polite in a way that felt rehearsed, always watching. I told myself it was normal teenage wariness. I told myself he'd warm up. I told myself a lot of things in those first years that I've since stopped telling myself. Daniel was a project manager for a commercial construction firm based in Sacramento, and I worked as a senior director of operations for a mid-sized logistics company called Hartwell Distribution. I'd been with Hartwell since 2012, working my way up from a coordinator role that paid $47,000 a year. By the time I married Daniel, I was earning $83,000 annually and managing a team of 11. We weren't wealthy by any standard, but we were stable. House, a 4-bedroom Craftsman on Delmore Street in Elk Grove, was in both our names after we married. Daniel contributed $60,000 from a prior property sale. I brought in the remaining financing. The mortgage was in my name. Marcus moved in with us in March of 2018. He'd been living with his mother in Roseville, but she'd relocated to Arizona for work, and Marcus had what he described as an opportunity to attend Sacramento State. He enrolled. He lasted 1 semester. By the fall of 2018, he was working part-time at a Best Buy in Rancho Cordova and spending most of his time in the guest room with the door closed. I was cordial. I kept things running. I made sure he had groceries and that the Wi-Fi password still worked and that nobody made him feel unwelcome. I did all of that. The first time I understood something was genuinely wrong was Thanksgiving 2019. Daniel's sister, Carol, had come up from Fresno with her husband, Ron. We were all at the table and Marcus made a comment, casual, almost offhand, about how this will all be mine someday. He was gesturing vaguely at the house. Carol laughed. Ron nodded like that was a reasonable thing to say. Daniel didn't react at all. I looked at Marcus across the table and he held my gaze for just a moment, then picked up his fork. Layla was 10 years old, sitting right there, focused on her mashed potatoes, and I don't think she registered it. I registered it. "You're not worried about that?" I asked Daniel later that night when we were getting ready for bed. He said, "He's just talking." By 2020, Marcus had stopped even pretending to look for full-time work. Daniel was covering his expenses, roughly $1,100 a month between his phone, car insurance, and incidentals. I noticed. I tracked it on a spreadsheet because I tracked everything. Marcus began making comments about Layla that I can only describe as dismissive, nothing overtly cruel. Just this pattern of barely acknowledging her, of treating her presence in the house as slightly inconvenient. If she asked him to move so she could get to the pantry, he'd sigh. If she was watching TV in the living room when he came downstairs, he'd stand in the doorway for a few seconds with this particular look on his face before going back to his room. In January of 2021, I found out that Daniel had updated his will without telling me. A clause left the house, the full property, to Marcus in the event of Daniel's death. My name was there as a concurrent beneficiary, but with a condition. If Daniel predeceased me, I would have right of occupancy for 12 months. After 12 months, the house would transfer to Marcus outright. I found this out because Daniel left the email from his attorney open on his laptop, which he'd left on the kitchen counter. I read it. I closed the laptop. I went for a very long walk around the neighborhood. I didn't say anything. Not yet. "You've been quiet," Daniel said that weekend. Long week, I said. He accepted that. He always did. The thing about Daniel was that he was not a malicious person. He was a passive one, which can be equally destructive, but the mechanism is different. He did not engineer things to harm me. He simply didn't think about me very hard when it mattered. He loved me in the way people love furniture they've had a long time, comfortably and without much examination. By February of 2021, I had started making calls. The first call was to a woman named Sandra Ackefer, a family law attorney in Sacramento with offices on Capitol Avenue. I'd found her through a referral from a colleague at Hartwell. I told Sandra everything. She listened without interrupting. At the end, she said, "The will isn't necessarily actionable right now, but I want you to understand your exposure." She walked me through it over 90 minutes. I left her office with 3 pages of notes and the beginning of something that felt like clarity. The second call, 2 weeks later, was to a financial advisor named Greg Yamamoto at a firm called Meridian Wealth Partners. Greg was in his 50s, methodical, with the kind of demeanor that never rose above a certain controlled temperature regardless of what you put in front of him. I laid out my situation. He looked at my accounts, my salary, my assets. Then he looked up and said, "You have more leverage here than you think you do." I started moving money. Between March and December of 2021, I redirected $3,000 a month from my personal savings into a separate account at a different bank, a credit union in Folsom where I had no existing relationship and where Daniel had never set foot. By the end of that year, I had $31,000 sitting in that account. I also began quietly consulting with Sandra Ackefer on a monthly retainer, $800 a month. I paid in cash, converted from a money order I bought at a Safeway on Laguna Boulevard on the 1st of each month. Marcus, during this same period, had begun spending more time on his phone. He'd gotten a new girlfriend, a woman named Tess who I never met but heard about constantly. He seemed, for several months, less focused on the house. I thought maybe the urgency in him was dissipating. I was wrong. He was focused on something else entirely, and I didn't know it yet, but that comes later. At work, 2021 was a significant year. Hartwell Distribution went through a restructuring in Q3, and I was offered a promotion to VP of Operations, Midwest Division. The salary was $120,000 annually, plus performance bonuses. The catch was relocation to Chicago. I turned it down. I couldn't uproot Layla, who was 12 and well settled in school, and I couldn't navigate what was happening at home from 1,000 miles away. I negotiated instead to keep my senior director title with a raise to $96,000 and expanded responsibilities. My director, a man named Phil Corso, who'd been in logistics for 30 years, looked at me across his desk and said, "You're leaving money on the table, Sandra." I said, "I know what I'm doing." He didn't push it. I didn't know that the same week I declined the Chicago position, Marcus had a meeting with a man named Brian Collies, who turned out to be an attorney who specialized in family estate law. I found this out much later, 11 months later to be precise, when it became directly relevant to everything. At the time, I was focused on building what I needed to build. By June of 2022, my separate account had grown to $68,000. I'd had 2 conversations with Sandra about the possibility of separating out my equity interest in the house through a formal legal instrument. Sandra recommended against it at that stage, too visible, potentially inflammatory given Daniel's existing will provisions. "Wait," she said. "Keep documenting, keep building." I trusted her. Close call number 1 happened in July of 2022. Daniel was going through some paperwork on the kitchen table, tax documents, I think, and he looked up and said, "Where's your savings? The joint account looks lower than usual." "I've been putting extra toward the mortgage," I said, which was technically true. I had made 2 additional principal payments earlier in the year. He nodded. "Smart." The room was quiet for a moment. He went back to his papers. Close call number 2 was in October of 2022. Marcus found a receipt, my fault. I'd left a Safeway money order envelope in the pocket of a jacket that ended up in the laundry. He brought it to me in the kitchen and said, "What's this for?" I looked at it. "Legal document," I said. He waited. "Estate planning," I said. "Your father and I are reviewing our documents. We should have done it years ago." Marcus looked at the envelope for another 3 seconds. Then he handed it back and walked out. I threw it away. I was more careful after that. By January of 2023, I had $94,000 in my Folsom account. I also had something else, 2 years of documented observations, written in a locked note on my iPhone and backed up to a private iCloud account Marcus didn't know existed. Every dismissive comment, every odd behavior. The Thanksgiving comment in 2019. 3 instances in 2022 where Marcus had gone through my desk when I wasn't home. I knew because I'd set up a small trail camera disguised as a Bluetooth speaker on the bookshelf. I had footage, not of anything conclusive, just of him rifling, but I had it. Close call number 3 came in March of 2023. Daniel's sister Carol called me directly, not Daniel me, and said, "Is everything okay between you two? Marcus told us you've seemed stressed." "Marcus told you that?" I said. "He's just worried about the family," Carol said. "I appreciate that," I said. "Everything's fine." I hung up and sat very still for about 4 minutes. Marcus was talking to people. He was laying groundwork. I didn't know yet exactly what the groundwork was for, but I could feel the shape of it pressing through from the other side. I called Sandra that afternoon. She said, "How soon can you come in?" I was 3 weeks away from having everything I needed legally organized when Daniel had a massive stroke in his office on April 4th, 2023. He was gone before the ambulance arrived. He was 50 years old. He was sitting at his desk reviewing project timelines when it happened, according to his colleagues. He was probably looking at a spreadsheet. I don't have the language for what the grief was. I'm not going to try to put it here. What I can tell you is that the grief and the fear arrived at the same time, and they were tangled together in a way that made the next several weeks feel like trying to walk through water. The will was filed for probate on April 28, 2023. Sandra walked me through what it meant in practical terms. I had 12 months of occupancy rights to my own home. After that, Marcus inherited the full property, the house where Layla had grown up, the house whose mortgage had run through my account for 7 years, the house I'd refinanced in 2021 to capture equity when rates were low, a process that had required my signature, my credit, my financial history. That house. Marcus came home from wherever he'd been spending his time, and within a week of Daniel's death, I could feel the shift. He was almost pleasant. He made coffee in the mornings. He asked Layla about school. He was performing something. In May of 2023, I met with Sandra and Greg together for the first time. The $94,000 in my Folsom account had grown. I'd made 2 moves Greg recommended in late 2022, and the combined balance was now $112,000. Sandra had the documentation. Greg had the projections. I looked at both of them across Sandra's conference table, and I said, "What do I actually have here?" Sandra said, "Enough, if we move in the right sequence." We began. The first action was a formal claim against the estate based on my documented mortgage contributions. 7 years of payment history, refinancing costs, property improvements I had funded from my own income, a new roof in 2020 at $18,000, a kitchen renovation in 2021 at $32,000. Sandra filed the claim in June of 2023. Marcus received notice through his own attorney, Brian Collies, on June 19th. That was the day his pleasantness ended. By July, the house had become cold. Marcus was on his phone constantly. He barely spoke to me. He looked at Layla with something I can only describe as calculation, and it made the hair on my arms stand up in a way I couldn't entirely explain. I started keeping Layla close. I started watching. On August 8th, 2023, Layla came home from school and told me that a woman had come to her classroom and asked to speak to her privately. The woman had identified herself as being from a county agency. She'd asked Layla questions about home, about whether she felt safe, about whether anyone had ever hurt her. Layla, who is 14 and sharper than anyone has ever properly given her credit for, had answered calmly and said she felt completely safe and loved, and that she would like her mother present for any further questions. The woman had left. I sat with Layla on the edge of her bed that evening and I said, very carefully, "Did she show you any ID?" Layla said yes. She'd photographed it with her phone. She showed me. I called Sandra at 9:14 p.m. Sandra said, "This is escalating faster than I expected. We need to talk about protective documentation." That night, I gave Layla a journal. It was a Leuchtturm 1917 hardcover, forest green, her favorite color, from the supply I kept for work. I told her I wanted her to write down, every single day, exactly what happened at home, what she ate for breakfast, what she watched on TV, what homework she did, what time she went to bed, every small and unremarkable detail of our completely ordinary life together. I showed her how to date and timestamp each entry. I showed her how to be precise. She said, "Is something going to happen?" I said, "I want us to be ready if it does." She said, "Okay." Then she opened the journal and started writing. That was August 8th, 2023. She wrote in that journal every day for the next 112 days without missing a single one. The formal complaint was filed with Sacramento County Child Protective Services on October 14th, 2023. I know this because Sandra obtained the filing date later during discovery. The complaint alleged physical abuse, emotional abuse, and educational neglect. It claimed Layla had reported these things to a trusted adult, which was false, and that there was corroborating physical evidence, which was also false. The complaint was filed by a third party, which CPS regulations allow. Sandra later confirmed the third party had been acting on information provided to them directly by Marcus, through Brian Collies, in a chain of communication that was documented in Collies' own billing records. The fabrication had been deliberate, structured, and carried out with professional assistance. I found out on November 6, 2023, when Sandra called me at 7:22 in the morning. I was in the kitchen making Layla's lunch. The light was gray, early November gray, and I had NPR on low in the background. Sandra said, "They've scheduled a welfare check with law enforcement accompaniment. The date is November 10th. I said, "What time?" She said, "Between 2 and 4 in the afternoon." I said, "All right." She said, "I need you to listen to me very carefully." I turned off NPR and sat down at the kitchen table with my pen. There were 4 days between that phone call and November 10th. I want you to understand what those 4 days looked like, because people sometimes imagine that preparation like this happens in a montage, fast, clean, efficient. It didn't. It happened slowly, with coffee going cold and phone calls that lasted an hour, and documents spread across the dining room table until midnight. Sandra and I met in person on November 7th. She had a one-page summary of everything we'd built over the past 2.5 years. The trail camera footage, the dated journal entries, the financial records showing my contributions to the house, Marcus's communications with Collies, a signed declaration from Hartwell Distribution's HR department confirming my employment history and stable income, a letter from Layla's school confirming her perfect attendance and strong academic standing, letters from her pediatrician documenting healthy checkups at every appointment going back to 2019. The pediatrician's name was Dr. Alina Voronova. She'd known Layla since she was 4. Sandra spread it all out and said, "This is what we have." I looked at it. "Is it enough?" She said, "The journal is your strongest piece, if it's what I think it is." I told her about the Luchtum. I told her Layla had been writing in it every single day for 98 days at that point. Meals, activities, conversations, homework, TV shows, bedtime. 100 days of domestic normalcy in a 14-year-old's handwriting with dates and timestamps. Sandra said very quietly, "That's going to do it." On November 8th, I called Layla's school and asked to meet with her counselor, a woman named Ms. Patterson. I told Ms. Patterson that there might be an inquiry related to Layla and I wanted her aware of the situation. Ms. Patterson listened, then said she could provide a written statement about Layla's demeanor, academic performance, and social engagement without hesitation. She said Layla was one of the most grounded kids she'd worked with in 15 years. I thanked her and drove home and cried in the parking lot for about 7 minutes. Then I went inside and made dinner. On November 9th, the day before, I sat with Layla after dinner and I told her as clearly and as calmly as I could that some people were going to come to our house tomorrow. I told her they were from the county. I told her they were going to ask questions. I told her she did not need to panic, she did not need to perform anything, and she did not need to protect me. I told her the only thing she needed to do was be herself. She looked at me and said, "Should I bring the journal?" I said, "Only if you want to." She said, "I want to." November 10th, 2023. It was a Saturday. The light came in low and clear. I made pancakes in the morning, Bisquick, the kind from the yellow box because that's what Layla liked. Marcus was somewhere in the house, quiet. He'd been watching me all week with this particular expression I'd come to recognize, confidence with an edge of anxiety underneath it. Like someone who'd placed a large bet and was waiting for the wheel to stop. They arrived at 2:31 p.m. I know the time because I looked at my phone when I heard the knock. 2 officers from the Sacramento County Sheriff's Department and 1 woman I would learn was named Patricia Gomez, a licensed clinical social worker with the county's Child Welfare Services Division. Patricia was in her 40s, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and a canvas bag full of folders. She was professional and she was kind, and it was clear she had done this many times. Marcus was standing in the hallway behind me when I opened the door. He'd positioned himself there. He wanted to be visible. He had his phone in his hand. Patricia introduced herself and the officers and said they'd received a report and were required to conduct a welfare check on a minor in the home. I said I understood. I invited them in. One of the officers, a younger man whose nameplate said Delgado, walked through the main floor in a standard visual assessment. Patricia asked if she could speak with Layla. I said yes. I called upstairs. Layla came down the stairs in jeans and a gray sweatshirt from her school's drama program, wearing socks with cats on them. She looked at Patricia without alarm. She looked at the officers without alarm. She looked at Marcus and something in her face went very still, and then she looked at me. I gave her the smallest nod. She turned and walked calmly down the hall to my bedroom. We heard the door open. We heard it close. Patricia glanced at me. I said nothing. 20 seconds later, Layla came back. She was holding the forest green Leuchtturm, 1917. She walked directly to Officer Delgado, not Marcus, not Patricia, the officer, and she held it out to him. She said, "This is my journal. I've been writing in it every day since August 8th, in case this happened." Officer Delgado took it. Patricia Gomez's eyes moved from Layla to the journal to me and then, very slowly, to Marcus. The room was quiet. I mean completely quiet. Somewhere outside, a car went down the street. The refrigerator cycled on. Patricia said, "May I?" to Officer Delgado, and he handed her the journal. She opened it. She read for 2 minutes. Nobody spoke. Marcus was still standing in the hallway with his phone in his hand, and I watched him, across that distance, begin to understand that something had gone wrong with his plan. Patricia flipped to the beginning of the journal, read a few entries, flipped to the middle, read a few more. Then she looked up at Marcus directly and said, "Sir, are you a resident of this home?" Marcus said, "I'm the homeowner's son." Patricia said, "I need to ask you to wait in another room while I finish my assessment." Marcus said, this is family property. I have a right to." Officer Delgado said, "Sir, another room." Marcus went. I heard his footsteps on the stairs. Patricia sat down at the kitchen table, and I sat across from her and she opened her folder. She had the complaint. She went through it line by line. Each allegation, physical abuse, emotional abuse, educational neglect, she read aloud and then looked at me over her reading glasses and I answered. And Sandra had prepared me for exactly this, and I answered every single question with a specific, documented fact. Physical abuse. Layla's last 4 pediatric wellness exams, all clear, conducted by Dr. Alina Voronova. I had the dates memorized. February 2023, August 2022, February 2022, August 2021. Emotional abuse. Layla's school counselor assessment, which Ms. Patterson had emailed me at 8:47 a.m. that morning as a PDF. I pulled it up on my phone and handed it to Patricia to read. Educational neglect. Layla's attendance record. Present every single day of the current school year. Honor roll, fall semester 2022. Honor roll, spring semester 2023. Patricia read. She made notes. She asked to speak with Layla privately, which was her right and Layla's, and I said of course and went to wait in the living room. They were in the kitchen for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the cable box. When they came out, Layla's expression was calm and Patricia's expression was different than it had been when she arrived. There was something in it that I can only describe as a narrowing, a specific kind of professional focus that meant something had clarified for her. She walked to the base of the stairs. She called up, "Sir, I need you downstairs." Marcus came down. He'd clearly been pacing, his shoes were back on, and there was a flush high on his cheekbones. He looked at the journal still in Officer Delgado's hands and then at Patricia and said, "So, what happens now?" Patricia looked at him steadily for a moment. Then she said, "That diary proves the child abuse claims were fabricated, and I'm required to note that in my report. We're going to need to look more carefully at the source of this complaint." Marcus said, I'm not the one who." Patricia said, The report indicates that the original complaint included specific details that could only have been known by someone with direct access to this household. The journal documents the same time period. The accounts don't match. Marcus's face went pale, not the pale of someone who's cold. The pale of someone whose blood pressure has just dropped because their body is registering something their brain hasn't fully caught up with. He said, "I want to call my lawyer." Patricia said, "You're not under arrest, but I'd suggest you do that." Marcus pulled out his phone. His hands weren't steady. I noticed that. He stepped away toward the hallway, and I could hear him trying to get Brian Collies on the line. He was speaking in a low, urgent voice. He was not succeeding at being calm. Officer Delgado had been reviewing the journal more carefully. He looked up at me and said, "She wrote this every day." I said, "Since August 8th. He said, "Including entries for October 14th. October 14th was the date the fabricated complaint had been filed. I said, "Including October 14th. He said, "What does it say for that day?" I said she was at school until 3:15. She had drama rehearsal. She came home and had leftover pasta for dinner. We watched a movie together. It was a Tuesday. Delgado nodded slowly. He flipped to October 14th in the journal. He read it. He looked up at me. "Is this all going to be in your report?" I asked. He said, "Yes, ma'am." Patricia had been making calls of her own, stepping onto the front porch. I could see her through the window, speaking quickly, one hand holding her folder against the November wind. When she came back inside, she had a different kind of authority in her posture. She sat back down at the kitchen table. She said, "Ms. Reeves, I want to ask you directly, do you have any knowledge of who filed this complaint?" I said, "My attorney does. Her name is Sandra Ockhaffer. You can reach her at this number." I slid a card across the table. Sandra had given me 6 cards. I'd been saving them. Patricia took the card. She looked at it. She looked toward the hallway where Marcus was still on his phone, his voice dropping lower. I said, "I also want you to know that this isn't the only documentation I have. My attorney has financial records, communications, and other materials related to an ongoing estate dispute that I believe provides context for why this complaint was filed." Patricia said, "I'm going to need that." I said, "I'll have Sandra send it over today." Marcus came back from the hallway. He looked at Patricia and then at me and then at Officer Delgado and then at the journal. Something in his face had reorganized itself. The flush was gone. What was left was a kind of gray, flattened quality, like a drawing someone had pressed too hard and smudged. He said to Patricia, "What does this mean for what happens to the property dispute? That's a separate." Patricia said, "I'm a social worker, sir. I'm not involved in estate proceedings. My report goes to the county. What the county does with evidence of a fabricated complaint is outside my direct purview, but it will be documented thoroughly." Marcus said, "I didn't fabricate anything." Nobody responded to that. The silence sat in the room for a full 5 seconds. I counted. Patricia stood up. She looked at Layla, who had been sitting quietly on the couch this whole time with a kind of stillness that I still think about when I want to remind myself that I raised her right. Patricia said, "Sweetheart, is there anything else you want me to know?" Layla said, "There are 112 entries in that journal. I didn't miss any days." Patricia smiled at her, a real one. Then she closed her folder and nodded at Officer Delgado, who handed the journal back to Layla, and they gathered their things and prepared to go. At the door, Patricia turned to me and said, "You'll be hearing from our office. And Ms. Reeves, I want you to know that what your daughter did today was exceptionally clear-headed." I said, "She learned that from watching me." After they left, the house was quiet in a different way than it had been before. Marcus was standing in the living room. He was still holding his phone. He looked at me, and I thought he might say something, and I waited, and he didn't. I said, "Sandra is filing the amended estate claim on Monday. We have documentation of the complaint being coordinated through Collies' office. The billing records were subpoenaed 2 weeks ago." Marcus said, "That's not you can't prove I was involved." I said, "I don't have to prove it in this room." He stood there for another moment. Then he went upstairs. I heard his door close. I heard him moving around up there, the sound of drawers, the sound of his closet. I went to the kitchen and poured out the coffee I'd made at 7 that morning and made a fresh pot. Layla came and sat at the kitchen table. She put the journal down on the table between us. She said, "Was that the thing you were preparing for?" I said, "That was one part of it." She said, "What's the other part?" I said, "Sandra takes it from here." Sandra filed the amended estate claim on November 13th, 3 days after the welfare check. The claim cited my documented financial contributions to the property, 7 years of mortgage payments, the roof, the kitchen, a fence replacement in 2022, cumulative total of $264,000 of my personal funds, and argued that Marcus's inheritance claim should be subordinate to my equitable interest in the property. The filing also included a formal complaint to the State Bar regarding Brian Collies's potential involvement in coordinating the fabricated abuse report. Collies had a problem, and he knew it. On December 4th, Marcus moved out. He didn't tell me he was leaving. He was just gone one morning. His room was cleared except for a lamp he'd left behind. The estate mediation was scheduled for January 17th, 2024. Marcus arrived with a new attorney. Collies had withdrawn from representation on December 20th. The new attorney was younger and looked tired. Sandra arrived with 3 folders and a banker's box. The mediation lasted 4 hours. At the end of it, Marcus accepted a settlement that allowed me to buy out his inheritance interest in the property for $145,000, drawn from the Folsom account, which by January of 2024 held $161,000. The house was transferred to my sole ownership on February 2nd, 2024. I paid the transfer fees myself. Marcus left Sacramento in March. He's living somewhere in Nevada now, as far as I know. He didn't come after the settlement. He didn't appeal. I think Brian Collies's situation had a focusing effect on his decision-making. The State Bar investigation into Collies is still ongoing as of this past fall. Sandra says it will likely result in a formal disciplinary proceeding. He hasn't lost his license yet. He may. Layla finished 8th grade on the honor roll. She's in high school now, freshman year, and she joined the debate team, which surprises no one who was in that room on November 10th. She still has the forest green journal. She keeps it on her bookshelf. She told me once that she'd been scared that day, just a little, but that she'd decided that being scared and doing the thing anyway was basically the definition of courage. I told her I thought that was exactly right. The house on Delmore Street is mine. The mortgage is mine. The equity, currently assessed at $420,000, is mine. I sleep well. For almost a year, everything was quiet. No calls from Marcus. No communications from Collies or anyone connected to that situation. Sandra and I moved to a standard quarterly check-in. I got the kitchen repainted. I put in new flooring in the upstairs hallway. I planted a garden in the backyard that produced actual tomatoes in August, which felt like the most ordinary and correct thing that had happened in years. Then last week, Sandra called. She said, "I need you to come in. Marcus is making a new claim. He's alleging the mediation settlement was reached under duress, and that the documentation related to Collies improperly coerced him into accepting terms." I was quiet for a moment. She said, "I know, I'm sorry." I said, "What do you need from me?" She said, "Whatever you have." I hung up. I went to the fireproof safe in my bedroom closet, the one I bought in October of 2023, the same week I set up the private iCloud backup. I entered the combination. I pulled out a manila envelope I'd placed there on January 16th, 2024, the day before the mediation. Inside was a recording, 94 minutes of audio. The entire pre-mediation meeting between Marcus, his then-attorney Collies, and a third party whose name I hadn't been able to confirm at the time, but whom I later identified through Sandra's subpoena work. The meeting where the strategy for the mediation had been outlined. The meeting where Collies had said, on tape, that the CPS complaint had been filed to strengthen the removal narrative in advance of the estate proceedings. I'd been waiting for Marcus to try something else. I called Sandra back. I said, "Check your email, I'm sending you something now." So, what do you think? Did Marcus go too far, or was I wrong to play the long game in silence? Let me know in the comments, and subscribe for more stories like this one.